أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers and sisters. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Qur'an in Surah Yasin, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. Immaculate is He who created all the pairs, from that which grows in the earth, and from yourselves, and from that which you do not know. And in Surah Naba, He says, وَخَلَقْنَاكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, and we have created you in pairs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in these ayat that, especially in the first ayat, that He has created everything in pairs. Not only among ourselves and things that grow from the earth, plants and also presumably animals, but He says even that which we do not know. And so in these ayahs lies an important idea in Islam that I think is often sort of hidden. We don't often think about it as much in its depth. And that's the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created everything in pairs. Now we might have heard this, people have mentioned this, we've read these ayahs in the Qur'an, but maybe we haven't reflected on this as much to see what exactly does this mean, especially when Allah is telling us even things that we don't know are created in pairs. So I just want to take a brief few minutes to reflect on what are some of the pairs, broadly speaking, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. And that lie in the way this world revolves and in the way Islam operates. So I want you to think about this a little bit. Try to brainstorm as many as you can. You can pause the video now. And then we'll go ahead and discuss some. So the most obvious, of course, if we look at these ayahs, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us as males and females. Of course, that applies to us as human beings, but it also applies to animals, and it also applies to plants, right? We know that many species have, male and female counterparts. So that's, of course, one obvious way. And then if we reflect more on ourselves, we can see many aspects where there are pairs. For example, we have a pair of eyes, we have a pair of hands, pair of feet, etc., right? So pairs are very abundant when we look at human beings, animals, and other creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But beyond that, if we look outside of people and other beings, if we look to the horizons, we see that, for example, there's day and night, right? There's the sun and the moon, which of course relates to day and night, right? Now, an interesting point is the ayah I recited at the beginning that describes how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created everything in pairs from Surah Yasin. First of all, it's worth noting that ayah is Surah 36, ayah 36, speaking of pairs. And the ayahs that come after this actually talk about the night and the day, and the sun and the moon, and how the sun can't overtake the moon and the night can't overtake the day. More broadly, there's the heavens and the earth. Then there's the dunya and the akhirah. Paradise, al-Jannah, and the hellfire, wal-Jahannam. We see these pairs appearing many times in the Qur'an. And then if we want to connect these two, we talked about pairs in ourselves, pairs in the horizons. In an earlier video, I talked about how Allah's signs are in the horizons and in ourselves. That's a pair too. Allah wants us to reflect on the horizons and on our own selves, or the microcosm and the macrocosm. Of course, then we have life and death. We have light and darkness. And Allah refers to these in pairs as well. Now, an interesting subtle point about life and death is that in the Holy Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. This is something that we might often miss. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that He created death and life. Not that He created life and death is the opposite of life. Death is the absence of life. But that death itself is a creation. In fact, He mentions death first. Now, the interpreters of the Qur'an might debate, what does this really mean? Is this metaphorical? Is this a creation of God? But some scholars say that no, Allah is telling us that this is its own creation, that this is a pair. It's not just that death is the absence of life. Again, I don't want to delve into those discussions, but it's an interesting subtlety when we look at the Qur'an. Now, everything we've talked about so far, for the most part, has been about creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of human beings, animals, plants, the heavens and the earth, paradise and hellfire. But we also might have heard before the expression of khalq wal amr, right? Creation and command. That creation and command both belong to Allah. And this expression actually appears in Du'a Jawshan al-Kabir, which I'll actually be talking about in a little bit. And so, we talk about the creation of Allah. What about the command of Allah? The legislation, right? So we also have expressions like takween and tashri'. The world of creation, again, this physical world, and then the world of tashri', the world of laws and legislation. And of course, part of that is the Qur'an and the Ahlul Bayt, right? This is a pair, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. We have the hadith from the Prophet that He's leaving us with two things, al-Thaqalain, the Qur'an and the Ahlul Bayt, and they complement one another. And when it comes to the Qur'an, we know that the Qur'an has its tanzil, the descent of the Qur'an, and the ta'wil, which we often translate as interpretation of the Qur'an. But literally, it refers to the ascent of the Qur'an back to its source. And we know the Ahlul Bayt provide the ta'wil. There's also hope and fear, al-raja wal-khawf, which has to do with paradise and hellfire, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to balance ourselves in terms of hope and fear. We should always have hope in the mercy of Allah, but we should also have fear in His punishment, right? And the Qur'an has many ayats that complement each other, addressing what should make us hopeful of paradise, and then contrasting that with what should give us some fear of the hellfire, or of the outcomes if we do not obey the commands of Allah. And many times we see that these verses are juxtaposed next to one another. And of course, of relevance to this YouTube channel, there's al-Zahir wal-Batin, the outer, the manifest, the exoteric, and the inner, the hidden, the esoteric. Now, if we look at Islamic history as well, we see that there's sort of pairs in how we can divide up history. So, for example, during the Prophet's time, we had the Meccan period and the Medinan period. And this is also reflected in the Qur'an. We divide the Qur'an into surahs that were revealed in Mecca and surahs that were revealed in Medina. And this is not simply a simple historical division, but we see that the style and the content of the Qur'an changes when we move from the Meccan period to the Medinan period. More broadly, we have the time historically that the Prophet brought us revelation, right, when the Qur'an was being revealed. And then after that, we have the Imams, which continued the command of Allah and continued the interpretation of the Qur'an, but during that time, no revelation was given. So we had the Prophet's time and the Imam's time, so we can divide up time historically into those two parts. Then, of course, during the Imam's time, we have two major eras, right? We had the time where the Imams were present with us, and now we're in the time of occultation. And during the time of occultation, we have, of course, the major and the minor occultation. Again, it's sort of, we can see that the Islamic history naturally has these pairs that complement each other. So, of course, there's one obvious one that I've so far not discussed, and that's good and evil, right? This is a very clear example. And there are many things that can actually fall under this. There's actually a hadith, there's many hadiths. Actually, the first volume of al-Kafi, Usul al-Kafi, which is one of the foremost collections of hadith in the school of thought of Ahlul Bayt, is Kitab al-Aql wal-Jahl, the book of intellect and foolishness, and it discusses many hadiths on this topic. Now, I'm translating aql as intellect, and I know there's a subtlety in how it should be translated, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to keep that translation which is commonly used. And one hadith in particular talks about the creation of al-aql and the creation of al-jahl, the creation of ignorance and the creation of foolishness. and then how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave 75 troops to al-Aql, and then al-Jah also wanted troops, so he gave 75 troops to al-Jah. And the hadith goes over each of these troops. So for example, we have the head of the troops of al-Aql is goodness, is good, khayr, al-khayr. And the head of the troops of al-Jah is evil, al-Shahr. And then we have, of course, iman, belief, and kufr, disbelief, and then, of course, many other virtues when it comes to acts like prayers and hajj and fasting. All of these are listed as troops of al-Aql, and their opposites as troops of al-Jah, or foolishness. Now you might say, this is sort of cheating, isn't it? Because we're just giving opposites now, right? Of course, everything you give an opposite, an antonym for, so now you're just saying everything's in pairs because they're opposites. But there's a couple points to make here. The first is that if we actually look at that hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He created Aql and He created Jah. And He talks about, specifically, He gives a story about their creation, right? And how He asked them to go back and He asked them to come forward, right? And of course, some scholars have interpreted this metaphorically, but there's clearly more to it than just, oh, these are just two opposites, right? If you don't have Aql, well, then you're lacking it, so we'll call it al-Jah, right? There's more to it than that, again, which we discussed when it came to life and death. The second point I'd like to make about this is that many of the things we discussed before were not contradictory opposites, right? Now, in this case, when we talk about this hadith, about Aql and Jah, we're seeing that these are opposing forces that seem to be in contradiction. In earlier cases, they weren't necessarily opposites, they were just two things that might complement each other, like the sun and the moon, the day and the night. Now, the day and night are opposites in a sense. Or the Qur'an and the Ahlul Bayt. You might say, well, those two are both good forces that guide us. Why, should we really be putting them in the same category? They are definitely different in a sense that they're both good forces and they complement one another. Whereas here we're talking about opposites that conflict with one another. But at the same time, when we think about the Qur'an and the Ahlul Bayt, we can think about them as opposites on some level. Not that they conflict with one another. But for example, you might have heard the expression al-Qur'an as-Samit, the silent Qur'an, which refers to the Qur'an, and al-Qur'an al-Natiq, the speaking Qur'an, which is the Ahlul Bayt. Again, they're not opposites, but silence and speaking are opposites, right? Similarly, when it comes to tanzil and ta'wil, the descent of the Qur'an, right? The revelation of the Qur'an, and then the interpretation of it, right? Again, they're not opposites, but descent and ascent are opposites, right? So we can think about them as complementing each other, right? In these terms. Okay, so we've discussed many pairs. Hopefully by now it's clear that in Islam and in the way this world operates, and the way Islam wants us to think about the world, there are just many pairs, right? Allah has created everything in pairs. There's one being that, of course, does not have a pair. And of course, that's Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah says He created everything in pairs. And He created this world to operate in terms of these pairs. Not just in the level of physical creation, but also metaphysical creations, and even the command and the legislation of Allah as well, as we've seen. But when it comes to His own existence, of course we know that He does not have a pair. He does not have an equal or a partner. That is the essence of Islam. That is the essence of Tawhid, which is the essence of Islam. By understanding these pairs, and by realizing how this world and the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is organized in terms of pairs, and going through a process of dialectics. Now, dialectics is a concept commonly attributed to philosophers like Hegel and Karl Marx, but in actuality, it exists. This concept exists in Islamic thought as well, and in the Qur'an and the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, and also in the works of Islamic scholars. For example, Sheikh Ahmad al-Ahsa'i, who was a contemporary of Hegel, was actually developing an Islamic worldview of dialectics, and how dialectics comes in the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt and in the Qur'an. And I'm actually going to talk about this in another video, insha'Allah, as a follow-up to this. But I want to end this video with a section from Du'a Jawshan al-Kabir, which, for those of you who might not be familiar, is a dua, a supplication that we are recommended to recite on the nights of Qadr, the nights of decree, Laylatul Qadr. And in this dua there's 100 sections, and in each section we recite 10 names or 10 phrases that describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And after reciting these 10 names, we recite a phrase, the same phrase after each section. We say, Subhanaki ya la ilaha illa ant, al-Ghawth, al-Ghawth, khalisna min al-nar ya Rab. And so I want to read for you one of the sections of this dua and to have us reflect on it. And insha'Allah, everything we've been talking about so far, we'll see how it connects. And if you're like me, a lot of times we're trying to recite this dua. It's a long dua. We have to get through all 100 sections. We're trying to do it in the night of Qadr. We have other things we want to do, so we want to quickly get through it. Or someone else is reciting, and we can't really stop and ponder necessarily because we have to keep up with the recitation, right? So I think sometimes we recite this dua in a bit of a hurry, and maybe some things occasionally hit us. Oh, that's an interesting thing that I want to go back to, or maybe, oh, interesting, I don't know what this name means or what this word means, right? But we don't necessarily have time to really deeply think about and ponder about each of these names, which is perhaps one of the true beauties and benefits of this dua, that it has really beautiful phrases that can give us new lenses by which we should think about Allah and our relationship with Allah. Now, I'm going to finish this video by reciting this section of the dua, and I'm not going to provide any explanation. I think it should be clear, insha'Allah, how this relates to everything we've been talking about so far, about Allah's creation of the world in pairs and of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يا من يقلب الليل والنهار يا من جعل الظلمات والأنوار يا من خلق الظل والحرور يا من سخر الشمس والقمر يا من قدر الخير والشر يا من خلق الموت والحياة يا من له الخلق والأمر يا من لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا يا من ليس له شريك في الملك يا من لم يكن له ولي من الذل سبحانك يا لا إله إلا أنت الغوث الغوث خلصنا من النار يا رب.